Welcome to the Classic Cinema Society podcast, where we all go a little mad sometimes. I'm your host, Christopher Pistol. Every episode I bring on a guest to discuss a classic movie, and we talk about its place in cinema history and how it holds up today. Today I'm joined by Paige Murphy, and we're talking about Psycho from 1960. Directed by Alfred Hitchcock, Psycho was a departure for the director at the height of his career, both artistically and commercially. At the time, the famous British director stunned audiences by departing from his grandiose style and stripping things down to their bare bones. The film tells the story of Marion Crane, a real estate clerk who compulsively steals $40,000 from her boss in order to make a new life for herself. While on the run, she stops at a lonely motel and meets caretaker Norman Bates, a strange young man who cares for his mother atop a large house that looms over the motel. To say any more about the plot would really be spoiling, admittedly one of the most famous plot twists in cinema history. For the rest of our discussion today, we're going to assume you've seen Psycho. If you haven't, hit pause right now and go watch the movie, then come back. Are you back? Okay, good. Well, it turns out Marion, our protagonist, is murdered in the shower by Norman Bates, dressed as his mother, whom he also murdered. He's the titular psycho. That's a pretty crazy plot for 1960. This film was chosen by resident Arkansas filmmaker Paige Murphy. Paige, thanks for joining me today. How are you?
I'm pretty good. How about you?
Pretty good. We just witnessed a crazy news event, but other than that, we're doing okay.
Yeah. What else is new?
Yeah, I'm going to keep it vague because, someone listening to this could probably just assume it's a dozen or so things.
Wait till November and then just insert every day.
Yeah. Okay, so before we dive into the film today, let's get to know our guest. Tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your film journey.
So, I just knew I loved movies as a kid. I mean, that's pretty, stereotypical, film school kid. But I didn't grow up, watching a lot of classics. I have an older brother, so I watched, the most classic we got was Star Wars and Indiana Jones and the James Bond movies, the older versions, and then Disney, of course. But yeah, I would just watch behind, when I was maybe in elementary or middle school, I would just watch all the behind the scenes videos, cast commentary, director commentary, things like that.
DVD junkie like myself.
Yes, got really obsessed with the Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings behind the scenes videos.
They have a lot of behind the scenes.
Yes, and so I just decided randomly, I guess when I was in middle school, I wanted to be in movies, and that was about it. And then went to film school with you for a little bit, and then I've had various jobs in the industry that often have not been the types of movies that I watched growing up, but still have been some cool jobs in there.
Right, and I gave away the goat, but you have made your own films. You've directed movies.
Yes. I have directed a documentary and then co-wrote some other films, several short films. And
you produced a movie. My movie, in fact.
Yes, I did.
My next question was, you kind of already answered, but did you watch old movies when you were growing up? And you said not really, except for maybe some James Bond, kind of Star Wars movies and Disney movies. And I was going to say that's pretty interesting because I think this is going to be a consistent answer from a lot of people, that one genre of old movies that a lot of people watch that don't really think of them as old movies are Disney movies, but some of them are as old as 1936.
Yep, older than this one.
Let me ask you another question. So do you I think I know that you have an appreciation for older movies now. Did film school kind of give you a greater appreciation for them?
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, maybe even more just exposure. Like I said earlier, with the oldest movies I'd watched, at least off the top of my head, were like Disney and, you know, James Bond, like year wise, you know, pre 1970. And so just having that exposure to more older movies that I'd seen before, and types of movies that I generally didn't watch as a kid, definitely, yeah, helped. I know a lot of people go into film school they want to learn how to work on set and they want to get a job, which is what we all want. But I also think it's important, especially for those of us who want to write and direct, it's important to get the education and the appreciation of older films.
Part of the reason why I started this podcast. So the movie you chose to talk about today is Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. So this is one of, if not the most famous film from Alfred Hitchcock, one of the most famous directors of all time. I've taught this film in film courses. This is one of the most studied movies of all time. There's even a documentary that's just about one scene in this movie, the infamous shower scene. So can you remember the first time that you saw Psycho, and what was your reaction?
It was in my film appreciation class freshman year, which actually was not, you know, part of, you know, the film major. It was, you know, we had to take, if you remember, we had to take, like, I think it was art, theater, or film appreciation at UCA. And so I took film appreciation, which was taught by a grad student, a film grad student. And so it was, you know, it was a night class, so we watched movies in their entirety. We didn't have to split it up like I know you said that you had to do for a couple of movies before.
So I did watch Psycho in film appreciation as well. It wasn't the first time I saw it, but I did watch it for that class. And the class was structured in a way that we watched, like, because the class wasn't long enough to watch an entire feature film, we would watch the first half of a movie and then continue it like 2 days later in the next class, which is, in my opinion, a terrible way to show students a movie for the first time. But yeah, unfortunately, that does happen sometimes.
Yeah. Thankfully, we got to watch it in one sitting, and I knew about the shower scene. I didn't know about the twist. And at this point, I would have been like 19, I think. So somehow I had managed to not know that. And I really enjoyed it. I was surprised by how it was just genuinely creepy, and it was just it was a fun watch, and then I enjoyed it even more rewatching it for the first time since then last night.
I first saw this movie when I was 12. I think recorded on a VHS tape just right off of TV. With no commercial interruptions, though. And I didn't know anything either. And I was surprised by how shocking it was, just like you were. It actually, I'm pretty sure that for a while, I remember after seeing this movie, like, taking showers still, but being afraid to close my eyes in the shower, because I was just convinced that, like, while washing my hair, if I closed my eyes, then when I opened them again, somebody would be standing outside the shower. So that's a, tremendous effect on somebody.
Well, the murderer, you see, crept in here very slowly. Of course, the shower was on, there was no sound, and
so when Psycho was released in 1960, it went pretty far in its attempts to shock. Hitchcock had a reputation, as a grade A studio filmmaker. He had just come off Vertigo and North by Northwest, which are these big, sweeping Technicolor films with big stars. And this is a total 180 for him. Studios didn't want him to make this film, mostly because of the content, because they thought it would be too shocking, too sort of grotesque. So Hitchcock decided to make this with his TV crew, with his Alfred Hitchcock Presents film crew. He decided to make it, very modestly, with a low budget, shooting in black and white. And it's surprisingly one of his biggest hits, and it's today remembered as one of his most famous films, maybe probably his most famous film. He was also influenced by William Castle in a lot of ways too, who made these very like low budget horror films, but also had this great gimmick when promoting films, that people would have to sign waivers that they wouldn't sue if someone was frightened to death during the movie. His big push for this movie was that nobody was going to be allowed in after the movie started, which was kind of a different way that people saw movies back then. They would go in, maybe late. It was a lot more casual sort of experience going to the movies back then. And Hitchcock was very adamant that nobody was going to be allowed in the movie theater after the movie started, mostly so that they wouldn't be confused when the main character disappears after like the 30-minute mark or so. So what do you love about this movie as far as like its editing?
The fact that the protagonist is killed off so early on is interesting, and then that leads to other POV shifts. Like, it's not, we see things from Norman's point of view for a while, and then from the sister and the boyfriend, and kind of back and forth. And so it's an interesting format, and I think partially in line with that is the pacing, which, especially last night, like, I was just thinking about the parlor scene between Norman and Marion. Like, it's completely riveting, even though it's just dialogue. And some of a lot of the scenes in the movie are not very fast paced at all. Like the cleanup scene, Norman cleaning up the murder scene is not, like, there's no music. There's it's just him doing his thing. He's very calm about it, but it's still very riveting to watch. And obviously the music is very effective, has become very iconic, but I think it's just as effective when it's not used. And then last night I was just struck, when I was making notes, I wrote in my notes that Anthony Perkins is the GOAT, because he's just so good. I mean, good performances all around, of course, but I think he just stands out, in my opinion.
Yeah, he's definitely, I think, the standout of the movie. I mean, he's so sympathetic, and I think that really carries you through the movie. We were talking about sort of like how this movie shifts perspectives. I mean, you start with Marion Crane, who you're immediately kind of sympathetic towards, because even though she's broken the law, she's committed a crime, she's stolen money, she's done it out of love, and she's stolen from her boss, who is this creepy old man, and she's doing something completely daring. But you're on edge because you are hoping she gets away. You're wondering what's going to happen to her, and then she pulls into this motel, and you're kind of like, wait a second, what's going on? Clearly there's something going on with this guy, Norman Bates. And that parlor scene you mentioned, how, riveting it was, just in the dialogue, because you're sort of taken on this journey of like, oh, this guy seems nice. Oh, wait, these birds I'm surrounded by are kind of creepy. And then just that little, when, they're talking about his mother, and she suggests, putting her in a home or something, and you see the sort of like darkness come out of him.
Wouldn't it be better if you put her someplace?
You mean an institution? A madhouse? People always call a madhouse someplace, don't they? Put her in someplace.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean it to sound uncaring.
What do you know about caring? Have you ever seen the inside of one of those places? The laughing and the tears, and the cruel eyes studying you. My mother there.
It's a really terrifying scene, and Perkins' his performance is really great in it. I don't know what else to say other than he is super, super great, and it's clearly, an iconic performance. It's crazy that we're talking about this now when his son, Osgood Perkins, has the #1 film right now. Longlegs is film he directs. So he's followed in his father's footsteps as far as like horror goes in a certain respect.
So it's funny that you bring up the the reason why Marion stole the money. Just as a side note, I vaguely remembered that plot point from when I first saw it, more than 10 years ago. But I was for sure rooting for her.
Oh yeah,
as she was doing this because of how sleazy that man was. I guess it's the man who was buying a house for his daughter.
Yeah, it seems to be her boss's business partner.
Yeah, and he's just the sleaziest man ever, who's probably old enough to be her father, and she's
clearly making a pass at her.
It kind of sucks that she gets murdered after that, but that's what I think. That's just one aspect that was funny to me, but just makes the whole story of it really is just fascinating how wild it gets from one beat to another.
Yeah, we haven't really talked about the shower scene yet, but that's, I think, the movie keeps you on edge because you so identify with Marion, you're so in her shoes, and when she gets murdered, like nearly halfway through the movie, it's like the worst thing that could possibly happen. I mean, it's the scariest situation because a character who is sympathetic has just been violently taken out of the equation. And ironically, we're sort of replaced with Norman as a protagonist, and we, very quickly sort of like fall in line with his perspective, because, at least up until then, we think possibly his mother did this, and he's covering up a murder, but he's doing it for similar reasons that Marion committed her crime, is that he's doing it for love. He's doing it to cover up for his mother. And
he very clearly, at least seemingly, has, this is not his first time cleaning up because he's so calm and procedural about it.
Yeah, I think that's a really clever, sequence as well, that the cleaning up of this crime is so detailed, Hitchcock really takes his time with this sequence. I mean, it goes on for a while because I think that the audience is thinking he's thinking that the audience is thinking of every little detail that could possibly, for cleaning up this crime, of checking the drawers, making sure that to clean the sink, to do every little detail, because the audience is kind of like thinking about that as well.
You just missed the most important part of that piece of paper that her sister finds.
Yeah,
later.
the piece of paper with the the most specific thing written on it. Oh, what are the odds? It's a good thing that it wasn't the word "the" that was just left in the toilet.
But other than that, I mean, he did a pretty good job. Besides that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, you're so in Norman's shoes and you feel so much for him that, that following sequence when he pushes the car into the swamp and it begins to sink. This is where Hitchcock, I think, is really testing the audience's allegiance, because this car starts to sink and you're watching it, and then it stops, and then for a minute you're like, oh no, he's not gonna get away with it, which is insane. It's we want him to get away with it. I guess we kind of do. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's really a great little sort of tease and almost meta reference for the audience to sort of think about whose side they're on.
Definitely felt that when he was talking to the private investigator, whose name I can't remember. When
Arbogast,
yes, he's and Norman keeps stumbling and being inconsistent with his story, and there's a moment where I'm just on edge for Norman. I'm like, wait, why? He did a horrible thing, but it's
right, yeah.
You forget that when you're watching him, because he's squirming.
Yeah. And it's great because he thinks he's pulling it off, and we the audience know he's clearly not. I always just think of also that great shot that is very suspenseful, where he turns his head to look at the book that the guy is showing him, and you just see the underneath of his chin. It's a very strange shot, and I don't really even know what it's meant to do other than sort of unsettle the audience. Yeah, so I want to go back a little bit to the shower scene. This is one of the most famous scene in movie history, not just I think horror history. The editing is so abstract. I mean, I think like the most practical way that is usually talked about was, well, it's 1960. You can't show a knife going into someone. You know, this isn't the slasher era yet. So we're gonna have to do this all with
nudity.
yeah, we're gonna have to do this all with sort of like perception. So we sort of like subconsciously think that we're seeing a knife go into somebody, but we never actually do. If you really break down the shots of what we're seeing, you know, we see the thrust of a hand, we see just the blade up against skin, you know, but we never actually see the knife go in. So it's a really interesting way to sort of like implant an idea into someone's mind without actually having to show them anything.
Yeah, I was thinking about that when I was watching it last night. How I think like you were saying, the constraints of the time when it was filmed make it more interesting. Because obviously, if that had been like in a scene today, it would just be a typical like slasher murder scene. Like there would be
and if you want to see that version, there's Psycho has like 3 sequels,
Yeah.
and they pretty much like show all the stuff they couldn't show in the first film.
Yeah, and so, you know, I know by today's standards, like that scene is still pretty tame. Obviously, at the time, it wasn't, but I still think that it's effective, even if it's not like as a whole, it doesn't like more. You know, there are other movies that unsettle me more than this movie, but I think it's still effective, even though you don't see the knife going in. And we don't need to see the nudity in order, like, I'm not anti-nudity in films at all, but I think that it's interesting how seeing, like, considering how this was filmed, both in the context of 1960, 1959, 1960, but also today.
Yeah, and if the editing doesn't do it, the music in the scene sure will. I mean, it's hard to believe that this scene was almost used without any music in it. That's apparently what Hitchcock originally intended to do, was to not have any music in it. But thank gosh, Bernard Herrmann, composer, changed his mind, and it's one of the most iconic like musical cues in film history. Like it sounds like the musical equivalent of someone being stabbed. There's no way else to really say it.
I'm sure I knew that it was from this movie, but I vaguely, very, very vaguely remember watching that scene for the first time and being like, okay, so this is what it's from, and this is
right. I'm sure a lot of people have that experience. I mean, it's been parodied so much in so many other films that I'm sure most people are having that experience of being like, oh, that's what this is from.
Yep. Or at least just like a moment of like, I might have known it was coming, but I might have thought, like, to a degree, I think maybe I knew it was coming, but like, oh yeah, this is finally like, this feels like, I'm sure it felt like a very important moment in my film study career. Filmmaking, film study career was watching that scene.
Okay, so like, why do you feel like this movie is still important today? Grandiose question.
I guess like I think you mentioned already that it pushed a lot of boundaries. Obviously with that scene, the bathroom scene, but also I was thinking back to, am I remembering right that a toilet hadn't been shown flushing on screen before this movie?
I've always heard that. I don't know if it's like 100% accurate. Some people have pointed out the fact that we see the toilet in the trailer for Psycho. So if it is like the first kind of like use of a toilet in a movie, then possibly the trailer for Psycho is the first time that people saw a toilet in a movie. But I don't know if it's a completely 100% accurate.
Yeah,
I'm sure somebody out there has fact checked this, but that's always been the sort of like, you know, one of the top 10 facts about this movie.
I'd like to look that up after this to see if that is true.
But it's not hard to believe with how strict the Hays Code was at the time, because that was definitely like one of the things you couldn't show in a movie.
Yeah. Well, and I imagine even if it's not literally the first time that a toilet was shown on screen, like it wasn't common for sure. And Even just so like just thinking about how funny it is that bathroom scene is provocative in more ways than one for the time. But yeah, I just think that going back to the POV shifts and the fact that it obviously has had an influence on horror, like no doubt about that. But to me, like I think it also it almost felt more like a noir or thriller than it did a horror. At least that's like genre wise, that's just how it made me feel. But to me, like having I don't know, like such a like a film so effectively pull off, arguably, I would make the argument, kind of like a multi-genre film with POV shifts where the initial protagonist, gets killed off less than halfway through, and the fact that there's multiple different ways the story could go, especially in the beginning when it's almost like a heist and or like a crime thriller. Just the fact there's just a lot going on in this movie, but it's still, insanely watchable, very entertaining, and boundary pushing.
Yeah, I think this movie kind of gets like, the genre that usually it's classified under is definitely horror or thriller. And I think Hitchcock, as his reputation, kind of is usually classified as a horror director. But horror up until this time is really like associated with monsters, with aliens, especially in the 50s. Ghosts and that kind of stuff. But Hitchcock's movies are always about people. They're always about a person, wanting to murder somebody or trying to get away with something, some kind of crime. So his movies don't really sort of like necessarily, I think, fall in with what we like traditionally think of as horror. But it is interesting that he sort of like garnered this reputation, the master of the macabre. But this movie does like sort of pushed a lot of boundaries in that sense as well. I mean, I was struck by watching it, just the fact that not just the fact that what we're seeing is pretty violent for the time, but even the fact that we're just like in a shower with somebody at all. Usually if you saw somebody in a shower in a movie, it was like like outside the perspective, but the camera's in the shower with her. We are in there with her.
Isn't when we first see Norman, who we think maybe is his mom up to that point, it's from the shower, right? When we see the silhouette come in the bathroom. It's not like an outside perspective watching this person come into the bathroom.
Oh yeah, no.
So that makes it even more eerie, like seeing the silhouette behind her
coming right towards the audience.
Yes.
Yeah, and I also kind of I think of this movie as like sort of a transition in the horror genre. I feel like there's like this at the beginning of the 60s and then Night of the Living Dead sort of at the end of the 60s. This sort of like transition away from your typical like monster mash, aliens, bug-eyed monsters, that kind of thing, into like, movies that will scare you, that are about people, that are about like real situations. It's not the monster under your bed, it's the guy next door. Those that really sort of like leads, I think, into slasher movies in the 70s and 80s. But I think this is kind of like a real sort of like marker, for that kind of transition in the genre. I also think, just as far as like inspiration goes, this movie is very teachable when it comes to shot composition, editing. I love talking about this movie, especially like the parlor scene, and then all the sort of like editing tricks and how it builds suspense, how Hitchcock builds suspense. We haven't talked about it yet, but like even the second half of the movie, the scene where Arbogast is like walking up to the house, he's like, it takes its time, like it really takes its time building the suspense, like showing him like slowly walk up to the house. We know what's in the house, so we know he shouldn't be going in there. And then like slowly walking up the stairs, and then that moment of like shock when he's attacked, and then that sort of like very like dreamlike feeling when he's like falling down the stairs. It's very sort of like nightmare fuel almost.
And isn't that one of the scenes where we get the above, or the, not aerial, but the shot from above
Yes.
the door looking
The
down?
God's eye view.
That's the first. Isn't that the first time we see that shot, and then it comes back again when Norman, or they use it again when Norman's carrying his
Yes.
now
His mother.
his dead mother's body.
Yes. Yeah, the first time we see it, I think, is that scene where he's about to attack Arbogast, and then it comes back to it later. So we have sort of like mirroring of shots as well.
Which I was thinking last night, I wonder if that is that, like, both of the times that shot is used is when like the movie needs to hide the fact that Norman is, or that Norma is actually Norman, and then the second time he's carrying her body but we can't see. So it seems like, I guess, partially partially just an interesting shot composition, but also partially like helps the narrative of, like, it makes things a little bit harder to see in the action. Makes it a little bit harder.
Yeah, deliberately hiding stuff from the audience. Yeah, I also just love how much tension and stuff is like foreshadowed throughout the movie. I mean, obviously we have this sort of like motif of stuffed birds, like setting up from the beginning, that Norman is into taxidermy. When he's having this conversation with Marion, he says like, "Oh no, I couldn't leave her because then her room would go cold like a grave." Like very much sort of like foreshadowing a lot of things. So this movie definitely, I think, warrants repeat viewings. You pick up on a lot of stuff seeing it a second time after you've already like know everything that you necessarily wouldn't pick up the first time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One thing that is criticized a lot is at the end, once we sort of like reveal everything, we have this sort of like long monologue from a psychiatrist about Norman and his condition and what's going on. Yeah, some not so PC stuff, maybe a little bit of outdated psychology. What did you think about that?
Yeah, no, I mean pretty much that, and the line about or the line about men who dress up as women, writing that off as a mental illness, or like chalking it up to sexual gratification. But obviously he goes on to say that that's not why Norman does it. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the only thing really in the movie that doesn't age super well, which is, I think, pretty impressive considering the time that it came out, and considering how problematic Hitchcock was in his personal life.
Yeah, sure.
Like the I guess the science, like you said, it's a little bit outdated, and but I guess it is what it is. I like I said, I think that's the worst offender.
Yeah, it just goes on for so long, and I think there are like some outdated sort of like stereotypes that are perpetuated by this. I mean, you could probably write an entire thesis about sort of like the origins of or the misrepresentations of trans identity within specifically horror movies, and how it's maybe perpetuated a negative stereotype. But yeah, I think there is a lot of that there. I was reading Roger Ebert's review of this, and he was basically like, his one small critique was like, if I could go back and change that ending, I probably would, and just like have just like one line, just like have one line. The audience, I don't think, needs more than that, especially like not a modern audience.
Yeah, no, for sure. And well, and even the like, I don't think they ever call it multiple personality disorder. I think he uses the phrase multiple personalities or two personalities, but obviously now that term, I guess it's like officially dissociative identity disorder now, but that's obviously a more recent thing that term was not around then.
Well, speaking of Roger Ebert, like one thing that inspired this podcast in the first place was reading Roger Ebert's reviews of old movies and his vehement belief that no film is old to the person who hasn't seen it yet. So Here's his take on the lasting impact of Psycho. So this is from Roger Ebert's review. What makes Psycho immortal when so many films are already half forgotten as we leave the theater is that it connects directly with our fears that we might impulsively commit a crime, our fears of the police, our fears of becoming the victim of a madman, and of course, our fears of disappointing our mothers. I thought that was interesting, especially the fact that when asked what scared Hitchcock, his response was the police.
That is interesting.
There's definitely like a fear of the police like instilled at the beginning of this film.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the fact that it's the private detective and then the sister and the boyfriend who cracked the case.
Right. Yeah, the police are really shown as not being super competent in this movie at all.
Of course, the victim, or should I say victims, hadn't any conception as to the type of people they would be confronted with in this house, especially the woman. She was the weirdest and the most... Well, let's go into her bedroom.
Well, I was going to say, I don't know if this would fit in, but you'll appreciate the fact that I watched this movie on Blu-ray last night because I own...
Nice.
I think it's a TCM Hitchcock box set on Blu-ray.
Yeah, you should definitely buy Psycho on Blu-ray or physical media. This is definitely a movie that has not been out of rotation pretty much probably since home video was established. But if you don't have it on physical media, Psycho can be found online wherever movies are sold or rented. As of this date, it's currently streaming on Watch TCM app. So if you have that app or you want to download it, you certainly can watch it for free. Or if you're hard up for cash, there's no way that your local library doesn't have a copy of this movie. So just mosey on down to your local library and ask for a copy of this movie on DVD. I'm sure they have it. Paige, thanks so much for coming on today. Is there anything you'd like to promote?
All right. Well, thanks for having me. My website is pagemurphyfilm.com, and my thesis film, Just Benjamin, is on there in its entirety, along with your thesis film, May, and other projects I've worked on. I'm also the outreach coordinator for this year's Filmmaker Forum at the Hot Springs Documentary Film Festival. It's going to be our second year, and it's for nonfiction filmmakers. It will have panels and forums and lots of really cool stuff. So for any nonfiction filmmakers or anyone who wants to get into nonfiction film, you can search for that and join us.
Okay, well, we love old movies. I'm sure you do too if you're listening to this. You can reach out to us on Twitter or through classiccinemasocietypod@gmail.com. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast. One of the best ways to help us is to leave us a 5-star review. It's really the best way to help us reach more classic movie nerds like you. Paige, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.